we've had here in the Senate since September. We need to sustain this important budget point of order when we vote tomorrow. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President,
Senator from Louisiana.
I suggest the absence of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Objection?
Mr. President, I support Senator Vitter's motion. There are multiple points of order that could be raised against this legislation. They've declared a number of the spending programs emergencies. Therefore, if you vote an emergency appropriations, it doesn't count against the budget, but it's real spending all the same. And normally we would expect that border enforcement and hiring of officers would not be an emergency. Neither would other aspects of what we're doing here be considered emergency. We were told by the sponsors of the legislation repeatedly, this bill will, excuse me, this bill will be paid for, and it will be paid for by fees and fines contributed by those who are here illegally as part of their payment to get citizenship and legal status. Well, that comes nowhere close to funding the legislation. This chart gives us some, I'll get to it in a second, but this chart gives us an indication of where we stand with regard to budget implication of the legislation. So the fines and penalties and fees that are part of this maybe bring in $6 or $7 billion. They said there was enough to pay for the bill. The bill originally started out at $6 billion. Then it went to $8 billion. And then with the Corker-Hoven amendment, it jumped to $46 billion. No additional fees on the illegal aliens. When they met with the support group, the Gang of Eight met with the real group that's been driving the bill, this coalition of special interests. They went to them and said, we need to raise some more money. And they said, well, you can't put any more fines on the people illegally. So they said, yes, ma'am, we won't put any more fines on that. We'll put more fees on legal immigrants in the future. So they raised fees on legal immigrants, but didn't raise fees on the people who are here illegally, that originally they said were going to pay for the entire bill. So that's important for us to fully understand. The money is simply not there. I would note parenthetically that the 2007 immigration bill that was on the floor and we debated and eventually failed, that bill would have raised as much as $8,000 per illegal individual. This bill only raises $2,000 and is to be paid over 10 years. This is not a burdensome payment. If you're going to say they paid a fine, as the sponsors of the legislation did, to become permanent residents and put on a path to citizenship. So it's about $17 a month. I calculated it out roughly. Now, that's not a big fine. You're allowed to work. You get a Social Security card, ability to apply for any job in America on an equal status with anybody else who's been unemployed, looking for work, their children looking for work, they need a job. Somebody who was just a few days before illegally here now has got full power under this legislation, if it were passed, to take that job. And so the idea that $17 a month is somehow going to be breaking the bank is not accurate. Now, the problem fundamentally with this situation is that it double counts billions of dollars. And we need to understand how this process works, this double counting. It was part of the 2,000-plus page Obamacare health care legislation. This thing is over 1,000 pages, 1,200 pages. And things get lost in it. And what is lost fundamentally in it, and the supporters of it ought to be more candid about this, is that to make their argument that the bill is going to bring in more money than it goes out, they have to double count Social Security and Medicare money. They just do. Senator Corker's made that argument. Basically, we've got this money coming in, and in one of the conventions of accounting that our budget team uses, the Congressional Budget Office, it calculates all the money coming into the government, all the money going out of the government, regardless of whether there's a trust fund or not. Another form of accounting accounts for the trust funds and accounts for general revenue. It's called general revenue is on budget, off budget is Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare Trust Fund, and some of our pensions and other funds. So look at this chart. I think it gives a picture of where we are. This is the true cost of this immigration bill. I'm ranking Republican on the Budget Committee. We wrestle with these numbers all the time. Under this, they claim that they've got a unified budget surplus of $197 billion. That's the accounting method where it's all the money comes in is accounted against all the money going out. But if you remove the Social Security surplus, that's $211 billion. If you remove the Medicare surplus, that's $756, showing that instead of having a surplus, we have a $70 billion deficit. You say, well, CBO said differently. No, CBO did not. CBO, in its report, explicitly shows that the on-budget accounting is negative, that it adds to the debt. It counts a surplus in Medicare and Social Security. Now, how could they do that? Well, these individuals, many of them, don't have a Social Security number. They're not paying Social Security and Medicare taxes. They're withholding the FICA on our paychecks. They're not paying that. Once legalized, they will pay that. There will be a new money coming into the Treasury. And these sponsors of the bill, so desperate to promote their bill and say it is paid for, say that Social Security payment, that FICA payment, is now available for them to spend over here on all the things they want to spend money on. And therefore, it's created a surplus. But it ignores something very important, Mr. President, that each one of those individuals who are paying into Medicare, paying into Social Security, are going to draw out Medicare and Social Security. It's their money. It's their retirement money. You can't put the money up for their retirement and spend it the same day and expect it to be there. This is how this country is going broke. This is how they handle President Obama's Obamacare. They double counted the money. Well, you say that's not accurate. Let me read you the letter I got from the Congressional Budget Office Director the night before we voted, December 23rd. We voted this. I voted against it. President, the Obamacare legislation passed on Christmas Eve. They finally got the 60th vote before Senator Brown from Massachusetts could be installed. And this is what the CBO said at the time. The savings to the Medicare Trust Fund under PPACA, that's the Obamacare, would be received by the government only once, so they cannot be set aside for future Medicare spending, and at the same time pay for current spending under other parts of the legislation. To describe the full amount of Medicare Trust Fund savings as both improving the government's ability to pay future Medicare benefits and financing new spending outside of Medicare would essentially double count a large share of those savings and thus overstate the improvement in the government's fiscal condition, close quote. Now, if that were a private business who sent out solicitations to buy its stock, and they said we're on a good basis, we're making so much profit, and they're counting as their profits the money going into their employees' pension plan, I think they'd be in big trouble. Don't you? Because it's not their money. It's money committed to the employee's pension. You can't claim it as profit and say, invest in my company, I'm making a big profit, counting the money that's the employee's retirement money. Well, this is what we've been doing. Senator from South Carolina used to say, if we've been looting a trust fund, and if we're in private business, we'd be in jail. And I think there's too much truth to that, frankly. So point is that. So this is undisputable, really. But because there is a score, a unified budget score method that says all money comes in and all money goes out, you have a surplus, you can count this as a surplus. Why is that? Well, because most of the people that will be legalized under this bill, those individuals are in a situation where they're younger. They're maybe 35. So they will pay into Medicare for a number of years, and Medicare for a number of years will see a surplus in their account. But after they reach retirement age and start retiring, the money is going to be drawn out. And in fact, right now, the amount of money paid in to Social Security and Medicare by American workers is not enough to cover the cost of their retirement. And that's why both of those accounts are in serious trouble, and we've got to do something about it. We need to be making it stronger, not weaker. This makes it weaker. You're taking the money that should have been going to fund the retirement accounts of the people that were previously illegal, who are now legal, and spending it on something else. So Senator Vitter is exactly right. There are multiple bases for making a budget point of order against this bill. And I believe the motion to waive the budget point of order was a motion to waive all of them. So this will be the only one we'll get to vote on, but there are others out there that could have been raised also. And so what about this argument that wages are supposed to be improved by the bill? We were told that and told that repeatedly. This is what the CBO report says. Quote, CBO estimates that S744 would cause the employment rate to increase slightly between 2014 and 2020. So this is a fact. So at a time of high unemployment, lower wages, we're passing legislation that will increase unemployment, make more people unable to find work. And this is a chart that was in the CBO report, not my chart. I didn't make this chart. It's in their report. And it points out the average wage would be lower under the current law over the first dozen years. So we're asked to vote for a bill that CBO says would make the average wage of American working people lower for a dozen years. Now, I don't see how that's rational, frankly. We have seen since 1999 the wages of American workers have been decreasing as compared to the inflation index. Their amount of money that they're making is falling compared to inflation. And that's a tragic thing, and it's been continuous. I thought it might be temporary, but it's been continuing steadily. And one expert, Professor Borjas at Harvard, attributes 40% of that to immigration already. And this bill will dramatically increase the flow of immigration. So I'm worried about it. So this is a chart, It has out here 2021, 2023, before it hits the line back where it was. And they say, well, then it's improving. Not so. Not so. If the bill hadn't been passed, we would have had some increase all along. The lines would have been how much higher? I don't know how many years it'd take for this ever to get back to where it would have been if the bill had never passed. And that's what the CBO says. It is not that consistent with common sense that at a time of high unemployment and you bring in millions of workers, that it's not going to pull down wages. You bring in more coal into America, you bring in more iron into America, you bring in more cotton into America, the price of those products fall. It's supply and demand. You bring more labor, you're going to have a lower wage rate, which David Frum has written is what the bill was designed for to begin with, pull down wages. So I just would say this: we need to think about this. I dispute this idea that there's no impact on wages by this immigration flow. So this is what will happen in the next 10 years. We're going to legalize 11 million people. About half of those are not working effectively in the real job workforce. Maybe they're doing part-time work, maybe family are taking care of them, maybe they're working in restaurants and lawn care companies off the books. All of a sudden they're going to be given legal status, and they'll be able to apply for any job. Truck drivers, forklift operators, coal miners, steel workers, work for the county commission, city council, state of Alabama. They can apply for all of those jobs. And so you're going to see a large increase in the supply of labor available for jobs for which they weren't eligible previously. Secondly, well, what about the normal legal flow? We now admit about 1 million people a year into America. That's at the most generous admission rate of any nation in the world, and it's pretty significant. It's very, very significant. And we've been absorbing that, and I think we can continue at that rate. However, this bill, in addition to the 11 million I just mentioned, will increase by at least 50% the number of immigrants that come into the country every year hereafter, which is pretty significant. And in addition, there's another 4.5 million that are waiting to come into America, and they've been tentatively approved, but there are limits on how many can come each year, and so they're waiting their time. They call it a backlog. They're just waiting their time. That's 4.5 million. They've been accelerated. So let's think this up. Under the current law, we were on track to admit 10 million people as immigrants into America, and by immigrants I mean people who want to stay here, get legal permanent residence, and become citizens. We're on track for 10 million if you did follow the current law. Under this bill, we will admit over the next 10 years to lawful status in America the 15 million I mentioned, the 11 plus the 4.5. Then we're going to increase by 50% the annual admission rate from 1 million to 1.5, meaning 15 million over 10, which means 30 million. So the number of people who will be given permanent legal status in America over the next 10 years will be 30 million, not 10, as if the law had been properly applied. Well, there's another category. These are people we refer to generally as guest workers. Guest workers come not to become immigrants, not to stay into the country permanently, but just come to work in an area where they can find a job. And it's supposed to be in an area where they're not workers to do the work. That's the theory, at least. And how will that be impacted by this new legislation? Well, it's going to be doubled. So the number of guest workers, which is very large now, is going to double under this legislation. I would say, first of all, it's common sense that the average wage is going to fall. It's common sense that unemployment will go up. It's common sense it's going to be harder for Americans in this time of high unemployment and falling wages to get a decent job with health care, retirement benefits. It just is. And people can spin and they can quote Grover Norquist and those kind of things to say otherwise, but Professor Borjas at Harvard says differently. The Federal Reserve economist in Atlanta says differently. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said they had hearings on these matters, and every witness acknowledged it would be bad for American workers, particularly low-income workers, particularly for African Americans and Hispanic workers that are already here. They would get hammered the most under this flow of this dramatic increase in workers. Well, they say we'll increase GNP. Well, it will. You legalize 30 million people, you're going to have a larger economy, and it'll be bigger. But the question is, per person, per capita, will America's productivity increase? Will our GDP increase? Well, what did CBO find? This is their chart. It shows that it drops. This is the baseline today. If we pass the bill, the per capita GNP of the United States of America, each citizen drops. That doesn't make us wealthier as a nation, as a person. So what if the economy grows a little bit, but everybody has less because you've got more people? That's what they say. 744 would reduce per capita by 0.7% in 2023. That's 2023. This is 2120. That's about 16 years that they chart that will be lower than it would have been if the bill never passes. So why would we want to pass legislation that clearly reduces the per capita wealth of America, our growth of GNP? I don't think that makes good sense. And I'm concerned about it, and nobody wants to talk about it. They just want to pretend that there's no limit to the number of workers that can be brought in, and that won't have a societal impact on Americans. Look, let's take a look at a few things here. This is Washington Post 2 weeks ago when we got the job report dealing with the jobs for the month of May. It was considered to be fairly positive. It was about our normal average increase during the recovery period from the recession, but it's still not much, not so good. Unemployment went up, even though we created, they said, 175,000 jobs, and that sounded good. We created 175,000, but you have to create about that many jobs each month to stay level, because we have more people coming into the workforce each month. Well, look at what they said in the article. The bulk of the job gains in May were in the service industry, which added about 57,000 jobs. Still, about half of those were temporary positions, suggesting that businesses remain uncertain of consumer demand. And, they go on to note, missing from the picture were production jobs in industries such as construction and manufacturing. Manufacturing shed 8,000 workers. Manufacturing jobs went down by 8,000. The increase was in service industries. The increase in half of those were part-time or temporary, not full-time permanent jobs. So anybody that says we're in a great shape with regard to job creation is not telling you the truth. Look at this article in yesterday's or today's Wall Street Journal. Nearly 12 million Americans were unemployed in May, down from the peak of 15 million. We had, at one point, a few years ago, 15 million Americans working. We now have 12 million Americans working. The percentage of Americans in the workforce today continues to fall. It's the lowest since the 1970s when women were entering into the workforce. That's why the percentage went up. But now we're down to that level again. People are not finding work. And the idea that you can bring in millions of workers well above the current rate and that this is somehow going to create jobs is hard for me to accept. If you create jobs at $175,000 a month, Mr. Adam Looney of Brookings Institution says, we're years away, close quote, from where we need to be in unemployment rate. The real reason is economic growth has not increased much. And it goes on to cite some real sad numbers that show the danger for people who have been unemployed for longer periods of time. It does appear, unfortunately, that somebody who's older, somebody who's not found the job for quite a number of months, finds it even harder to find a job in the future. And this is the Wall Street Journal. They support immigration aggressively, but this is their story. They talked about Mr. Ken Gray. He talked his frustration. In January of 2011, Mr. Gray's wife died after a battle with ovarian cancer. 3 months later, he was laid off from his job as an accountant manager at AT&T, where he had worked for more than 20 years. Still grieving from the loss of his wife, Mr. Gray was slow to turn his full attention to his job search. By the time he did, the Chicago resident was long-term unemployed, and he has struggled to get prospective employers even to respond to his applications. You just feel so discouraged, Mr. Gray said. You ask yourself, what's the sense of sending in a resume if you don't hear something? Close quote. Now 59, he's been living off his dwindling savings since his unemployment benefits expired last year. He says he remains determined to find work, but long-term job seekers are twice as likely to leave the labor market as to find jobs. And many experts worry that many of them will never return to work. That could create a class of permanently unemployed workers and leave lasting scars on the economy, close quote. And goes on to say, quote, once people reach a point where they no longer consider themselves employable, it's very difficult to pull them back, said Joe Carbone, president of Workplace, a Connecticut workforce development agency. Quote, we're losing thousands of people a day. This is like an epidemic, close quote. I don't think we can pretend this isn't reality. I think the CBO numbers probably understate the problem. Professor Borjas' studies would indicate that, and others would indicate that. Well, how about another example? This is from the New York Times, May 20th, a month ago, written by Jessica Glazer. Quote, the men began arriving last Wednesday, first a trickle, then dozens. By Friday, there were hundreds of them, along with a few women. They set up their tents and mattresses on the sidewalk in Long Island City, Queens, unpacked their Coronas and cards, and settled in to wait as long as 5 days and nights for a slender chance at a union job as an elevator mechanic. On Monday morning, those in line were more than 800, hoping for a chance at a job security with higher salaries and benefits. Andres Laraza, 25 had his eye on a position that includes minimum physical labor. Every 18 to 20 months, the union accepts 750 applications for the 150 slots for a 4-year program. While they waited, hopefuls lined the sidewalk along 36th Street. The union had rented 6 porta potties and hired 24-hour security guards. Overnight, they brushed their teeth with bottles of water tucked into their sleeping bags, folding chairs, or cars, and tried to get some rest. On Saturday, a light drizzle fell. Gary Dubatokwa, 20, whose father is a member of the local, waited for his shot. He is studying electrical technology at Orange County Community College, but would rather work with his hands than be in school. I just want to do whatever, wherever I got to start. I want steady work all the time, close quote. Millions of Americans, that's what they want. They want a job with a retirement benefit, a health care benefit, and a steady job. We're not creating enough of them. That's the problem. After Sunday's drenching rain, Monday morning dawned gray. A few arguments erupted as people tried to cut in line. Finally, at 9 a.m. Monday, the first man in line disappeared inside, and he came out and yelled, "Yay, I'm number one." And he stepped on the sidewalk. "Good luck, big guy," said another man in line. Well, this is the problem we're facing. And I would share with my colleagues, at the rate of immigration in the future, we'll have well over 100,000 new immigrants a month enter the country who are looking for jobs. We'll have more than that enter, but we'll probably have about 100,000 or so plus a month looking for jobs. What does our Congressional Budget Office say about our future economic growth pattern? CBO each year, as part of the budget process, lays out a 10-year projection of economic growth for America. And they project all kinds of things. They're not perfect, but they use the best data available from the Labor Department, academic studies, private business analysis, and they project how many people would be employed. They are projecting for America's economy what I think a large majority of other economists and private sector people are predicting. That is a new normal, where growth does not increase as fast as it has during boom times in the past. You've heard that phrase, a new normal. That's what I'm about through. This is a new normal, and that's what we're facing. They predict that from the second 5 years of our 10-year budget window, Madam President, we'll increase jobs in America by 75,000 a month. Well below the amount of people immigrating to America to get jobs under this bill. Should we invite people to come who are not likely to have a job? Should we invite more people to come than we have jobs for when they will make the new immigrants that arrive before them unable to have a good job? Should we bring in more immigrants than we can absorb, causing wages to decline for American citizens? Making it harder for American citizens to find work? Do we take those people that are not finding jobs, and do we now then place them on the welfare roll and put them on a government subsistence program when they've been independent and able to prosper previously in the private sector? What is the right thing for America, colleagues? I think we have to think about that. And these numbers from CBO show there will be adverse impacts on the economy, wages, and unemployment at a time when we need to be doing just the opposite. We need to be creating jobs, putting people to work. And we just simply have got to give first priority to those to whom we owe our allegiance, the people who fought our wars and pay our taxes and kept the country going when they were able to work. So I raised that point. And people don't like to talk about it, but I do believe it's honest and true, and a good immigration policy should be focused on a number of things. It should be focused first on the national interest, the interest of the American working people, whether they're lawful immigrants and not yet citizens, or whether they're lawfully here as citizens. We owe our obligation first to that cohort of people. They are loyal to our country, and we owe them our loyalty first. And then we bring in people at the rate that we think we can absorb that's healthy for America. Maybe the million people a year is about the right rate. That's where we are. I can accept that. But to have it increased by 50%, to have the guest worker program double, on top of allowing early entrance and legality to 15 million, that is a trend that I think is dangerous for America. So my position is this. Let's be prudent, friends and colleagues. Let's be cautious here. Let's don't be increasing the legal flow by 50% at a time of high unemployment when it looks like we're not going to be able to create enough jobs for those people who would be coming here. And we surely don't need to be doubling, it seems to me, the guest worker program at a time when we've got high unemployment. That's where we are, Madam President. I believe that that needs to be considered. I think the American people who are out here watching what's going on in the Congress need to be asking their senators and the members of Congress who will be taking these issues up soon, are you thinking about us? Who are you thinking about? Are you thinking politics, or are you thinking about me? Who's thinking about me? You meet in secret with the Chamber of Commerce, you meet with La Raza, you meet with politicians, you meet with the Meat Packers Group and the Immigration Lawyers Association, but you don't meet with the law enforcement officers who've told us this bill won't work. You don't have representatives from the heart and soul of America in there. Nobody's really expressing what kind of impact will be felt by them. So that's what my concern is, one of my many concerns as we wrestle with legislation. We can deal compassionately with the people that are here for a long time, and I will support that. But I believe we need a system that ends the lawlessness and a system that serves the national interest of the American citizen. I thank the Chair would yield the floor.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, first let me ask unanimous consent that I be recognized in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
And let me comment also, the senator from Alabama has really done a yeoman's job. He's studied this thing. He's looked at all angles. He has one great advantage over me. He's an attorney who really understands the ramifications of this. Let me just mention two things about the bill that concern me. One is that I have been privileged, maybe as much as any other member of this Senate, to speak at naturalization ceremonies. And if you've never done it before, I say to my fellow senators, do it. You'll have a totally different perspective on this whole issue that we're talking about. And that is getting to know people who have go through the legal channels. You look out there and you see that these are people who learn the language, who have studied the history, and I dare say would know as much about the history of the United States of America as we know in this chamber. And anything that is going to fast-track a citizenship is something that is concerning to me. Now, that's not why I'm here today. I've decided to come down knowing that the President of the United States was going to make a talk. And in this talk, I want to make sure that people understand that what he's advocating is the largest tax increase in the history of this country. And it's something that we we know that he's been trying to do in terms of his global warming activities over the last, actually a long time before he was first elected 4.5 years ago. His speech on global warming, he started delivering on all the promises that he gave the environmentalist base during his campaign. Now, when I talk about the environmentalists, I'm talking about a lot of the groups are good, well-meaning people. Some are not. Some are extremists. But leading up to his re-election campaign, the president had been given a pass by all these organizations because they knew that if the American people thought he was going to do what we now know he is going to do and what he announced today, that he would not be re-elected because of the cost of it. So he had been given a pass by the environmentalist groups like the Sierra Club, the Natural Resource Defense Fund, the Environmental Defense Fund, MoveOn.org, George Soros, Michael Moore, you know the crowd. And they said, oh, fine, but as soon as you are re-elected, since you can't be re-elected again, then we want to go and get all these things done. So all the groups want the president to use his regulatory power to make traditional forms of energy so expensive that there's no option but to use their preferred alternatives. But they understood that if the president wanted to get reelected, he would need to delay as many of these regulations until after his election. That's exactly what happened. And they are willing to do this because they believed it was that important to elect Barack Obama his second term as president, and as opposed to Mitt Romney or any of the others who were running. So they gave him a pass. They didn't talk about this. And as a result, he delayed many of the most significant regulations the EPA worked on during the first term until after the election. One was Boiler MACT. Let me explain what MACT is. M-A-C-T is Maximum Achievable Control Technology. What it means is what is the maximum in terms of something like emissions that can take place where you have the technology to support it. Now, this rule sets limits, this is on Boiler MACT, on emissions of industrial and commercial boilers that are actually impossible to meet because technology required by this rule isn't even available yet. It would cost the economy, and this is the analysis is done. No one, by the way, I say, Madam President, has disagreed with these figures. It would cost the economy $63.3 billion and result in about 800,000 jobs that are lost. It's called Boiler MACT. You know, every manufacturer has a boiler, and these are the ones that would be required to an emissions standard where there is no technology to reach that at this time. So he waited until the day after the election and didn't want the rule to cost so people to realize what it was until after Election Day. Another is the Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard. It's called the NAAQS standard. I know it sounds like we're in the weeds here a little bit, but look, it affects everyone in America. The president tried to redo President Bush's 2008 update of this standard during his first term, but as the election neared and the cost of the regulation became clear, he completely punted the effort. Now, however, we know that he is actively considering an update of this regulation that could lower the standard from 35 parts per billion to 60 parts per billion. This is on emissions. And this would put as many as 2,800 counties out of attainment. Let me tell you about what that means. And by the way, we have 77 counties in my state of Oklahoma. All 77 would be out of attainment. And it means you can't go out and recruit industry. You can't keep the jobs that you have because you are out of attainment. That's an official standing. This would be 2,800 counties out of attainment in the United States of America, including all of it in my state of Oklahoma. But one thing that the environmentalists want that the president has not been able to deliver, that's even worse than all the rest of this stuff, is to deliver on the CO2 regulations, which is the crown jewel of environmental regulations. In fact, there's an MIT professor named Richard Lindzen. He's supposed to be one of the outstanding, perhaps the premier climate scientists in America today. He said the regulations on carbon dioxide, I'm quoting now, is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. Now that's a pretty strong statement. And this is because everything, every manufacturing process, every refinery, every hospital diagnostics machine, every home, every school, every church would have to be regulated. And if you can control carbon, you can control every decision anyone ever makes. And this is what the liberals want. They want government to control everything. And their crown jewel is CO2. And that's where the whole thing started. You remember a lot of them are saying now, well, we never did say it was global warming. Now it's climate change. They've changed it quite a bit around as people realize that some of these things aren't true. I can remember when people were talking about the global warming. Now we know that we're actually in a session that part of the cycle that it's going down. But that's not important. What's important is they want to regulate carbon dioxide. That's their goal. So the president first tried to push greenhouse gas emissions on the nation in 2010 when the Democrats had supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. That bill, the last bill that they had was called the Waxman-Markey bill, 2 House members. It was a cap-and-trade bill. A cap-and-trade, we all know what that is. We've been talking about it now for 12 years. That's where you have someone, they cap emissions, and then they can trade those around, they can buy and sell them, and it results in a huge tax increase. It would have regulated any source of emissions that emitted 25,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions or more. Now, that's very important because what he announced today is far greater than that. In other words, those bills were only going to regulate the emissions of industries that emitted 25,000 tons of greenhouse gases each year. Now, that came to a total cost of about $400 billion a year. Again, I'm using these without documentation now because I've been using them for 12, we've been documenting them for 12. No one is arguing with the fact that if we pass cap and trade at 25,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions a year, it's going to cost the economy about $400 billion. And so that's a huge amount. While that may not be the largest tax increase in history, what he promoted today would be. Congress squarely rejected this, and while the bill passed the House, it failed miserably in the Senate. And that is because it would have lowered standards of living for the American people across the country, forced businesses to shut down. It would have equated the biggest tax increase in American history, and I think people understood that. Now, that was what has happened in the past. So what this president wants to do is what they could not get passed in terms of legislation, they're going to do by regulation. The American people knew what was going on, knew what impact this legislation would be, and they told their representatives to vote against it, and they did. And many of those who voted for it are no longer in this chamber today. They were defeated in 2010. But now, with the president's re-election squarely secured, and the environmentalists have been crying for the president to act aggressively on global warming, it's payback time. You know, we understand, Mr. President, you couldn't push this thing by regulation before the election because you wouldn't have been reelected. But now you're reelected. We have a law that means you can't be reelected again. So it's payback time. And he's doing it unilaterally by passing Congress using authority he's claiming under the Clean Air Act. Now, in the words of a very prominent Democrat Congressman John Dingell, this would be a glorious mess. Because instead of regulating only the biggest pollutants like Waxman-Markey and those who wanted to regulate only industry that emitted over 25,000 tons a year, the Clean Air Act regulation would regulate any facility emitting over 250 tons. So it's not 25,000 tons that would be regulated. It's anything over 250 tons, which means that you can't even calculate how much that would cost in terms of a tax increase. As the President announced today, he will begin this process with the regulation of greenhouse gases from new and existing power plants. Now, the President may have said today that he'll work with the states and utilities to make sure that they get a policy that they like, but that's just window dressing. It's putting the lipstick on the pig. Legally, the President cannot get around the requirements of the Clean Air Act. All right, the Clean Air Act was passed a long time ago. In fact, I supported it. We had the Clean Air Act regulations back when I was serving in the House. They were good, and they worked. But they do cause for regulation of any facility emitting 250 tons of greenhouse gases a year. It wasn't meant for greenhouse gases, but make that kind of emissions. And while he might not be talking about it, the law he's using to justify greenhouse regulations will not let him stop with regulating just power plants or allowing him to craft a policy that states that. He doesn't have a choice. The law requires him to eventually impose regulations on every single industry in the country, every single industry, one at a time, with unelected bureaucrats doing the heavy lifting along the way. This means that every school, every hospital, every apartment will eventually be regulated by the President's EPA, and at much greater cost than the $400 billion a year. That was expected under Waxman-Markey. Now, keep in mind, Waxman-Markey bill was the last cap-and-trade bill that they tried to pass through, and it was soundly defeated. In fact, it's so high, no one has ever calculated what the cost would be to the American people if they had to regulate down to 250 tons. Let me give you an example. My state of Oklahoma, I always calculate at the first of each year how many federal taxpayers do we have in my state of Oklahoma. And then I do the math every time something comes along. Well, in terms of regulating under those industries over 225,000 tons of emissions a year, that amounts to $400 billion, which is about $3,000 a year for each taxpayer in Oklahoma. And that's what you have to stop and realize, that the cost of this thing is not little, it is huge. But today's announcement doesn't come as a surprise. We've known that they've been working on these regulations since he was first elected, scheming to give his environmental base exactly what they want. Roger Martella, former general counsel of the EPA, recently said that, and I'm quoting now, 2 years is about the minimal time it would take to go from soup to nuts on a rule like this, and that these rules don't come out of the clear blue sky and involve lengthy internal deliberations before the public even gets the first peek at them. So we know that what's been going on right now has been happening for a long period of time. Further, the Congressional Research Service recently put out a report saying that President Obama already has spent $68.4 billion on climate change activities since he's been elected. Now, this didn't require a vote. This was all done by the President. And so we have that's been taking place. And the CBO substantiated this by saying the annual spending on climate change has reached an annual level of $7.5 billion, with an additional $35 billion being provided in the President's $825 billion stimulus plan. And the President's been intent on giving his environmental base this victory for a long time, and he's willing to bypass Congress to make it happen. And the reason is it won't pass Congress. We've had his bills here. They've been defeated every time. I would look at the majority leader right now and say, I'll bet you couldn't come up with 35 votes to pass cap and trade in the United States Senate. But on regulations, he can do it without having to go out and get the votes. The impact is clear. It is the crushing of our economy. As I spoke on the floor last night, developments in horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing have resulted in a boom in energy production. Oil production in America is up 40% in the last 4 years. It's not because President Obama is president. It's in spite of his policies, because all these things have happened in the hydraulic fracturing. By the way, I know a little bit about that. The first hydraulic fracturing was done in my state of Oklahoma, and that was in 1949, and there has never been a case of groundwater contamination in the years since then, and over 1 million applications. Now, if we had a 40% increase in the production in this country in 4 years, it all came from the private and the state lands. None of it came from the federal government, because this administration won't let us drill and produce in that area. In fact, the report came out that I just quoted and said that on federal lands it has been reduced by 7%. So while overall oil production is up nationwide, on the federal lands, it's down by 7%. The President's setting us on a course of unilaterally disarming our economy, the same as he's doing to the military. He wants to impose costly regulations on our energy and manufacturing sectors that no other nation on earth has. China and India, Southeast Asia, Mexico, all of these nations know that you need cheap, reliable energy, and they have to have it in their countries. They are never going to pursue these regulations or waiting for the day that America does it unilaterally. Now, why would that be? Because if we do it, they know that our jobs are going to have to find energy someplace, and they have to go someplace to find it, and they'll be after those jobs. Any unilateral greenhouse regulations that we have in the United States will only shut down our domestic production. In fact, we had, when Lisa Jackson was the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, I asked her the question, and this is live on TV, and she gave me a very honest answer. And I said, you know, if we were to pass any of these cap-and-trade bills, like the ones I've been talking about, would this lower overall emissions of CO2? And she said no, because the problem is not here. It's in China, it's in India, it's in Mexico and other countries where they don't have regulations. Now, you could carry that argument on out and say that if you pass these things and we do it unilaterally in the United States, as the President suggested today, it's going to actually have the effect of increasing CO2, because as people go and seek those countries where they can actually do this and where they don't have any restrictions at all. So there's no need for the President to take us down this path. He is beholden to his environmental base, which claims global warming is the biggest threat facing humanity. Many have said in recent months that all of the major weather events of the last decade have been a result of global warming. Some have said, even claimed that in Oklahoma's recent tornadoes are a result of global warming. This isn't true. At Oklahoma University, if you talk to them down in the Weather Center down there, they say that this year has not been any different than years past. We plotted our tornadoes since 1950. Now, you don't have the tornadoes in your state of Nevada like we do in the state of Oklahoma. But we've had them since the 1950s, and the trend is just about the same. It's not any higher this year, last year, and the year before than it has been in the past. It's because we've been having these events since the dawn of time that many environmentalists now refuse to refer to global warming as global warming, and so they call it climate change or anything else that the public will buy. So let me just kind of conclude. You'll likely not be hearing many of these environmentalists talking about the fact that during the last 15 years, there has not been any increase in temperature as reported in The Economist. But even if they did acknowledge this, with the term climate change, they have an alibi, because climate change by its name doesn't necessarily mean warming. It can mean anything. The President's announcement today of his new plan to regulate greenhouse gases to combat global warming does not come as a surprise. He's been working on it for years. So I would only just conclude and say, let's remember what it was that Richard Lindzen, the foremost authority in America on this subject, stated when he said that regulating CO2 is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. And remember the other thing, and that is all this expense, all this trouble we're talking about going through, all that the President announced today, is not going to reduce CO2, according to not a Republican, but to the Democrat former director of the EPA. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Mr. Leader.
There will be no more roll call votes tonight. At 11:30 tomorrow, I remind everyone we're going to have a motion to waive the budget point of order, and we'll also vote after that on the Leahy amendment as modified. That's 1183. And following that, vote on a motion to vote cloture on the committee reported substitute. So we have those votes already set up. I've been to the White House for the last while, a couple hours, with Senator McConnell, and I got back, cloakroom, and we're working on an amendment list. During my absence here, the staff's worked very hard with, we've worked among ourselves, we worked with Republicans, trying to come up with a list of amendments. We're not there yet. I'm informed that the last half hour or so, we went backwards rather than forward. But we're working on this. We can still do it, but we have to keep our eye on the prize and make sure that everyone is willing to give a little. Because right now there's too many amendments that will never be agreed to. But this can be done. We'll continue to work on this. A majority of both caucuses want amendments. But having said that, you know, simple majorities won't do it. But I'm hopeful and confident we're going to be able to work something out on amendments.
Mr. President.
Senator
Madam
from Rhode
President.
Island.
Madam President, more specifically, my apologies to the presiding officer.
Quite all right.
Madam President, I wanted to come to the floor today. There are a number of my colleagues who are going to be speaking in the next hour about the President's announcement today of his plan to address carbon pollution and the changes that it is wreaking, really, on our planet. We've just heard from the distinguished senator from Oklahoma a lot about the politics and the motives behind the President's decision, but we can disagree about the politics and the motives. I think we should be past the point of disagreeing about the facts. And the facts are that in the past 15 years, during which the distinguished senator said we've seen not any increase in temperature, we've actually had the hottest decade on record. And I'll get the exact figures in a moment, but I think 10 of the 12 hottest years on record have been in those past 15 years. I'll be more precise. I just heard the distinguished senator say that, so I don't have the exact numbers, but there's been a terrific spike. If you go to the property casualty insurance industry, the property casualty insurance industry is not an industry that is heavily involved with Democratic or liberal politics. These people who do their calculations, they make their living by trying to predict correctly, and their cold-hearted actuaries have no purpose other than to provide the insurance industry the best possible information, and they are showing an exceptional spike in both the number and severity of storms that we are seeing, and they're having to adjust their insurance practices accordingly. I hope that we can find a way to work together on this, because I think the President's step that he took today is one that is long overdue and vitally important to our economy, vitally important to our national security, vitally important to our international credibility, and most of all, vitally important to our children and grandchildren. This is the great issue and responsibility of our time, and I'm delighted to see that the President has stepped up to it. I'll make one last point, and then I'll yield. I see the distinguished senator from Hawaii is on the floor, and I know he was at the President's announcement with me, and I know he wants to say a few words. But this has been described, trying to do something about this and trying to put a price on carbon has been described as the biggest tax in history, perhaps, and as something that would amount to the crushing of our economy. I think it's pretty safe to show that neither of those statements are accurate. For starters, there's nothing that says that the government has to keep the money when it's in a carbon pollution fee. It could go straight back to American families and be essentially a wash in the economy. And in fact, by going back to families 100 cents on the dollar and changing the economic behavior of the industry for the better, it actually, I think, will prove out to be an economic plus. Over and over again, EPA regulations have been imposed that created more economic benefit for the country than they cost. And I'm actually pretty confident that this regulation, once it gets going, will create more economic benefit for the country than it will cost. And every dollar of it could go back. It would mean as much as $900 a year for every American family to offset any increase in energy costs and to spend how they will, but to do something that Republicans ordinarily agree is important, and that is to set the market straight so that there isn't an imbalance in which the price of a product doesn't reflect the true cost of a product. That's Law 101, it's Economics 101, it's Fairness 101. It should not be a proposition that we are debating. But I intend to stay here until this conclusion, this hour or so that we have is concluded, and I'll yield right now to the distinguished senator from Hawaii, who, as I said, was also at the President's announcement in the blazing heat. But since he's from Hawaii, he's more used to the heat than I am. I yield.
Yield before he